All right. I think that has got everything lined up the way it is supposed to be. Just give me a second to make sure it's all playing the way it should. Okay. So let's go ahead and get things started for now. I'm just going ahead and make sure everyone is on mute because what we're talking about today is a very sensitive topic and one that unfortunately seems to get more and more sensitive and more important every single year. In Judaism, as we will see, there is a command to rebuke. Rebuke is the fancy word for criticize, for pointing out that what someone else is doing is wrong. Unfortunately, being able to tell somebody that something is wrong is very difficult. To do so without hatred is even harder. And to be able to hear someone else's rebuke, their criticism of you without hatred is hardest of all. So this is going to be a challenging topic, but one that I hope when people study and work at improving will bring great benefit to them as well as to everyone else around them. It is a failure to be able to both give and receive rebuke, criticism that has caused many catastrophes and has the potential to cause many more. So do not skip this looking for the easier topics like keeping kosher or the more philosophical topics like the afterlife. This is a critical part of living a good and proper life according to the Torah. So let's get down to work. First, we have to understand exactly why this is such an important topic of what the danger really is. And we can turn to the Talmud to give us an understanding of the severity of this problem. Why was the first temple destroyed? Because of three evils in it: idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed. Meaning at the time of the first temple, when you read through the words of the prophets, you realize that there were some standout crimes that were taking place during those generations. Idolatry, obviously, immorality, meaning things like adultery or incest, and bloodshed, meaning murder, are all of the three biggest crimes that were taking place. And because they were taking place, clearly the people had shown they had no interest in the temple and what it represented. So for it to be destroyed should be no difference and no change to them. Thankfully, it did awaken us and we did improve. How do we know that? But why was the second temple destroyed, seeing that during the time it stood, people occupied themselves with Torah, with the observance of mitzvot, and with the practice of tzedakah? So during the time of the second temple, idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed were not nearly as common as they had been during the time of the first temple. So if they were not the main cause, then what was the problem during the second temple period? Because during the time it stood, baseless hatred, what we call sinat chinam, prevailed. This is to teach you that sinat chinam is deemed as grave as all the three sins of idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed together. Now that is some pretty heavy-duty claims. To say that hatred is as bad as murder or idolatry or immorality is making a bold statement. But this is one that our sages felt we needed to hear, that sinat chinam, this causeless, baseless, pointless hatred, was indeed as bad and would lead to such catastrophes. And that's something that we're going to talk about. Now, at the same time as knowing that hatred is such a big problem, we also know that from Leviticus, this week's Torah portion, as a matter of fact, that we have to talk to our fellows, sometimes in difficult circumstances. In fact, we are commanded, you shall not hate your kinfolk in your heart. Wonderful. Reprove your kinsmen, but incur no guilt because of them. So I'm not supposed to hate them, but I am supposed to point out their mistakes. Now, if you live in the modern world, you may find that, just an impossibility. I criticize people because I hate them. I hate them because of what they're doing that makes me want to criticize them. Hate and criticism go hand in hand. They are inexorably linked. If they didn't do anything wrong, I wouldn't hate them, and then I wouldn't need to rebuke them. And because they have done such horrible things, clearly I'm going to tell them they're wrong, but you can't stop me from hating them at the same time. No, no, says God. That is not the way it is supposed to work. This habit we have gotten into, and which has been prevalent throughout history, of hating people because of what they did and criticizing them only because we hate them, is a terrible, toxic poison for any society or group. We are supposed to be able to manage both parts of this verse, to act without hate and to still be able to criticize. And that's what we're going to look into, the techniques as well as the importance of this for our class. Oh, sorry. Very important Hebrew word is tochacha. That's the word in Hebrew for rebuking, reproving, criticizing. And tochacha is a very important concept. And as we'll see, it is not something that we only do for people we don't like. Tochacha is in fact intended to be a gift to others, not only an attack. Well, really, it should never be an attack, as we'll see. So if I say rebuke, reprove, criticize, or give tochacha, we're talking about the same thing. Now, why do we know that this is so important? Well, we have only to look to the example of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses, our teacher, Moses, our leader. The 4 actions of Moses, our leader, inform us of his greatness of spirit, full of divine courage. He could not bear to see persecution and oppression and did all he could to save others. How do we know these? What are these 4 actions that reflect this? When he was in the royal palace, Moses went to see with his own eyes the situation of our brothers, the house of Israel. That's situation number 1. He was willing to go out and see what the persecution and oppression was that was happening to the slaves. 2, his beating of the Egyptian who beat one of our fellow Hebrews. That was his second act of tochacha, of rebuke. He never intended it to be lethal, but he was trying to stop the terrible suffering that person was causing. 3, his rebuke to the evil Hebrew who beat his fellow man. We know the very next day when Moses went out again and he tried to break up a fight between 2 Hebrews, that one of them turned to him and said, "What are you going to do? Kill me like you did the Egyptian?" Which you have to imagine is a pretty chutzpah thing to say. But we can see that Moses was trying to stop the fight between those 2 people as well. And then number 4, his saving the 7 daughters of the Midianite priest Yitro, also known as Jethro in English, from the hand of shepherds and robbers. So even when he had left Egypt and had nothing, no longer had his position in the palace, but now was just a stranger in a strange land, he still stepped up to try and help the daughters of Yitro, because he saw persecution and oppression. He could not remain silent. From this, every person of wide heart and Holy Spirit must learn to take a stand and save their brothers and sisters from the hand of those who exploit, oppressed, or tormented them. That this is the dugma, the example that we need to follow, that when we see something wrong, we have to speak. Now, you might be thinking, going back to our initial discussion, well, if I saw somebody beating a slave, if I saw somebody harassing these daughters of Yitro, of course I would hate them. And that would give me the strength, the power, the anger, the fire to stand up for them. No, that's not the lesson we are meant to draw. Just let's continue and we'll see. So from Rambam, we get a general picture of what tochacha, of speaking up, should be like. If one sees that someone sinned or walks in a way that is not good, it is their duty to bring them back to the right path and point out that they are wronging themselves by this evil course. As it is said, you shall surely rebuke your neighbor, from our passage in Vayikra, Leviticus. So that is the basic idea. You see somebody not doing something that you don't like. They chose the wrong radio station, not doing something that you think is unpleasant, like they are enjoying the sunshine when you want shade. But when they are actually transgressing or are setting themselves into a path of life that will lead for bad outcomes for them. In those cases, you have an obligation, not the right, but the duty to speak up, and speak up to them. This is very important, as it is a contrast to what we talked about when we talked about Lashon Hara and other forms of gossip and talebearing. It is not speaking about them, it is speaking to them. So how does this work? One who rebukes another, whether for offenses against the one who rebukes them, or for sins against God, meaning whether they've done something wrong to you that is a transgression, not just your opinion, but an actual transgression, or if they are doing something that is a sin against God, even if you are not the target. In that case, you should administer the rebuke in private, meaning that you should not speak to them publicly about this, but should take them aside and have a conversation where it is private. Speak to the offender gently and tenderly. This is not the time for shouting and screaming and cursing and all of the other horrible things we see people do. And point out that the rebuke is offered for the wrongdoer's own good. You have to actually be genuinely interested in the consequences of the behavior to the person that is misbehaving. This is not your chance to complain about what's happening to you. It is your chance to expose them, to educate them, to help them understand that what they are doing is wrong for them. In this way, you secure for the other life in the world to come. Now, if the person accepts the rebuke, well and good. Mission accomplished, we're great. If not, the person should be rebuked a second and a third time. And so one is bound to continue the admonitions, the criticisms, the rebukes, until the sinner assaults the sinner, admonisher, and says, I refuse to listen. So there is a limit. Once the person says, I'm not going to listen to you, then we do back off. And we're going to talk about that balance in a little while. But until the person says, I'm not going to listen anymore, we continue to try and teach, to educate, to rebuke, to provide this criticism in private, gently and tenderly, and for their own good. Because whoever is in a position to prevent wrongdoing and does not do so is responsible for the iniquity of all the wrongdoers whom that person might have restrained. That we have an obligation to help them for their benefit, and also because if we choose not to speak up, if we choose to stay silent, then we are guilty by complicit. We are complicitly guilty. We are partnered with them in everything that they do that we could have raised an objection to. The person who sits by and watches somebody beat their child is responsible for the wounds of that child. Not as much, of course, to the same degree as the person who is actually causing the abuse. But if you have the opportunity to speak up, then you are obligated to do so. And to fail to speak up, you are transgressing the mitzvah of you shall surely rebuke your neighbor. All right, any questions or comments on this element? Okay. Now, we can get back to that concept of the temple being destroyed for this by looking at the story as portrayed in our tradition. The story of the destruction of the Second Temple doesn't focus so much on Rome itself. They are a bit player in this drama. Instead, it focuses on a guy named Bar Kapsa. Now, Bar Kapsa was once treated with exceptionally humiliating rudeness by another man at the party, the host of the party. Now, we'll go over that concept of what happened some other time, and you're welcome to look up the story of Bar Kapsa to see it in all of its detail. But suffice it to say, the host of the party treated him with absolute rudeness, not murdering him, not robbing him, not any sexual immorality, just rudeness. Now he, Bar Kapsa, thought to himself, since the sages were sitting there and did not stop it, I will go and inform against them to the Romans. So Bar Kamsa is so offended that the sages who were in attendance did not stand up and tell the host that he was wrong for humiliating Bar Kamsa the way he did. He decides that he would like to punish the sages. Of course, he would probably also want to punish the host, but he felt more personally aggrieved, more pained that the people who had the most learning and should thus have the most wisdom sat by passively while such a horrible injustice took place with this humiliation, that he wanted them to be punished even more than the original host that was causing the problem. When he, Bar Kamsa, told the Romans that the people were rebelling against the empire, they asked for proof. Since he claimed that they offered up the sacrifices sent on behalf of the Romans, they didn't offer up the sacrifices on behalf of the Romans, he told them to put this to the test. The Romans, who were of really terrible character in many ways, did try to support the local culture in a way that would reflect positively on them. So the Romans did, with many of the different countries that they were conquering, did provide sacrifices that could then be slaughtered in their honor. So they sent with him a fine calf. On the way, he made a blemish on its upper lip in a place where we consider it a problem for the altar, but the Romans did not. A sacrifice must be completely unblemished, and our definition of blemishes is different than a Roman definition of blemish. So Bar Kamsa deliberately creates a problem in the sacrifice that the Romans will not understand, but we will be reluctant to then offer on the altar. So what happens? When it reached the temple, the sages were inclined to offer it in order not to offend the Romans. So the majority of the rabbis said, look, the Romans are going to go crazy if we don't sacrifice the sacrifice, even though it is blemished. But one rabbi said, Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulus, people will say that blemished animals are offered on the altar, right? If you do that, everyone's going to think that it's okay to bring blemished animals. It's going to diminish the honor of the altar. Then they proposed to kill Bar Kamsa so that he should not go and inform against them. Now, you might wonder about the legitimacy of that, but if somebody is about to start a war and you have the opportunity to kill them, then that is not entirely a bad decision. It was obviously the second choice, not the first, but it is within the realm of possibility. But again, Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkula said, is one who makes a blemish on consecrated animals to be put to death? Is this a death sentence? Does that mean everybody who makes a blemish on an animal from now on is going to be executed? Rabbi Yochanan thereupon remarked, because of the scrupulousness of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulus, our house has been destroyed, our temple burnt, and we ourselves exiled from our land. That because he continued to raise these objections as the rabbis were trying to find solutions, in the end, they chose not to sacrifice the animal and they chose not to kill Bar Kamsa, and the Romans chose to commit murder and destroy the temple as well as many, many thousands of lives. So this is all began because the rabbis would not speak up when Bar Kamsa was being humiliated at the party. And it continued because they would not speak up and stop Rabbi Zechariah's objections when they knew that that would lead to war. The rabbis are very critical of themselves, and hopefully by that example, show that being critical of each other is an important quality, that we should speak up when there is a problem. And if we fail to do so, well, the temple itself will be destroyed. But sometimes we have to. And the book of Proverbs gives us some guidance on this. Like I mentioned before, when looking at Rambam, there is a balancing act of how much and when we rebuke. And the book of Proverbs gives us this among many of its words of advice. To correct a scoffer or rebuke a wicked person for their blemish is to call down abuse on oneself. Do not rebuke a scoffer, for they will hate you. Reprove a person, a wise person, and they will love you. Instruct a wise person, and they will grow wiser. Teach a righteous person, and they will gain in learning. So this portion of the book of Mishlei, of Proverbs, is trying to tell us that if you are wise, then you will appreciate the criticism that is given to you. You will thank the person giving it, you will take it as being for your benefit, and you will allow it to change your behavior so that you will behave better in future. That is a gift that happens, and we should be grateful when done. If a person is wicked, then words of rebuke would not only be wasted, but might actually create a violent backlash. And this is a difficult point to always be able to judge. Sometimes words we think will be welcome are hated, and sometimes words that we think would be hated would actually be welcome, and the person would benefit from it. The way we try to steer around this, of course, is if the person is behaving in a violent or hateful manner, then we do not try to engage with them during that moment, but wait for another opportunity. And for everyone, we always remember those principles that Rambam outlined for us of doing it in a private way, doing it in a peaceful way, in gentleness and tenderness, and doing it very consciously for the good of the person that we are rebuking. So now we know roughly when we should and when we shouldn't, but how much do we have to rebuke? Well, from Sifra, the great collection of Midrash on the book of Leviticus, we learn the following. How do we know that if a person has rebuked a neighbor 4 or 5 times without success, that person should continue to rebuke? Because it says, you shall surely rebuke. It is a doubling with the infinitive, which is considered to be a continuous intensifier. One might infer that the reproof then should be carried as so far as to discolor a person's face with shame. But it says, you shall not bring guilt upon the other. So we see here both the minimum amount as well as a maximal amount. We are obligated to continue rebuking them as much as we can and as much as is necessary, remembering that once a person has corrected the behavior, we do not bring it up again. We do not shame them by reminding them of their previous mistakes. But if the mistake is continuing to be made, then of course we continue that rebuke, that tochacha. However, if the rebuke is reaching a point where the person's face is becoming discolored, that they are becoming ashamed of their behavior, this was considered to be a draining of the blood, a whitening of their face in humiliation, then you have gone too far. Then you have rebuked to a point that is actually bringing guilt upon yourself. You are now harming the person rather than helping them. Rabbi Tarfon said, in this generation, there is no one capable of rebuking. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, in this generation, there is no one capable of receiving rebuke. Rabbi Akiva said, in this generation, there was no one who knows how rebuke ought to be worded. So these 3 rabbis are each sharing their own lament, their own pain, that in their days, people are not able to speak rebuke, tochacha, properly, and thus it will not be accepted. And even if it is given properly, some say that people will not be willing to take it on board, but will respond very negatively. And this is the difficulty of how carefully will we be able to speak the rebuke, and how properly can we listen to the rebuke that's being given. Now, I believe that today people are capable of both giving and receiving tochacha, but I do believe that it is extremely difficult. We have polarized ourselves along so many different axes of division that it is very hard for people to both speak without hate and to hear without hate. But it is entirely possible. One instead just needs to be open, which is not easy. But as Ben Zoma tells us in Pirkei Avot, who is one that is wise? One who learns from every person. As it is said, from all my teachers, I have gained understanding, taken from Psalm 119. From all my teachers, everyone can be my teacher. Everyone can teach me. And they become my teacher. They become the all of the book of Psalms. And that is what gives me wisdom. if I close myself off to anyone, if I make myself unable to learn from anyone, then now I am not as wise, I am not as capable as I would have been had I been able to hear whatever there was that was worthwhile with what they are saying. Does that mean we have to accept every criticism and every rebuke that is given with hate, bitterness, and vileness? Of course not. But can we learn from the flaws of that person as they give that kind of rebuke? Can we learn from the failings of that person, of what I must do differently? Can we learn from the way they speak, how I must not speak? That is something that we can learn, even from the worst of the people out there that are speaking so badly. And that then should give us the reminder that we need to welcome rebuke. As we see here from the Talmud, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, a person should love rebuke, since as long as there is rebuke in the world, ease of mind comes to the world, good and blessing comes to the world, and evil departs from it. As it is says, those you rebuke find favor, and a good blessing falls upon them. Taken again from the book of Proverbs. One of the worst things that can happen if you are a student is to get back an essay or a test from the teacher that just has an A written on the top. Sure, the A might feel nice, it might help your GPA, that's all very wonderful, but we learn nothing from just an A. We don't learn what we did wrong and could have improved. We need the notes, the criticisms, the red pen to show us what could be done differently in order to do better. The A might be the top for this class, but that doesn't mean it's the top of where you're going in life. And any opportunity to learn should be welcome. So we make sure that we are always open and looking for that type of criticism, that rebuke, that guidance from people that point out our mistakes. We should not resent it, we should welcome it. And without it, the world would be in great danger. Indeed, in our current situation where many are afraid and unwilling to speak their mind and unwilling to do so properly, the world is in danger as we are unable to discuss the matters that are most important to all of us. And so with that in mind, we have to continue to recall and remind ourselves over and over and over again what Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina said, a love without reproof is no love. And as Reish Lakish said, reproof leads to peace. A peace where there has been no reproof is no peace. All of us, I'm sure, are familiar with situations from our own life or the lives of others we know, where two people may be having an argument, and at some point, they will just stop talking. They're no longer shouting, but the issue was not resolved. The issue is still there. That silence is not shalom. That is not peace. That silence is merely a ceasefire, and nothing has been resolved, and there has been no reconciliation. In order to truly be in a relationship that is loving with another person, you must be able to tell them when something is wrong, and you must be showing them that you are willing to hear when something is wrong. If you cannot do that, then you have not really found the love that you need to express for them, and you have not shown them that you are open for the fullness of the love they have to give you. We have to be willing, we have to be vulnerable to having our mistakes pointed out. Without it, it is just a ceasefire in the relationship, and there is never a sense of peace. So who can rebuke? Obviously, it's hard. How do we do this? Well, as we see here from Likutei Moharan, from the teachings of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, rebuke is a great thing, and it is incumbent upon each Jew to rebuke his friend when he sees him acting in a way that is not allowed. As says, from our verse, you shall surely rebuke your neighbor. Even so, not everyone is able to rebuke. As Rabbi Akiva said, I would be surprised if there is a person in our generation who is able to rebuke. And if Rabbi Akiva said this about his generation, all the more so today. Because when one rebukes who is not able to rebuke, then one will not be able to receive the rebuke, and it causes a putrid smell in the souls that hear it. So what Rabbi Nachman is trying to say here is that we must be careful that we don't rush to rebuke, that many people want to do nothing more than attack others with criticism for everything they do that is wrong. And they do so publicly, they do so loudly, they do so insultingly, they do in a way that is an assault, that is aggressive and mean. And that is simply inappropriate. And when done so, it creates a worse situation than if you had kept your mouth shut in the first place. Which means, before we open our mouth to give rebuke, we have to ask, will I be able to speak to this person in a calm, tender, and gentle way? Am I doing this for their benefit, or am I doing this only because I am angry, only because I want to lash out at them with my words because of how bad I feel the situation is? If you are not able to speak lovingly and tenderly for their benefit, then it would be better to keep your mouth shut. Now, we are talking about rebuke. We are not talking about protecting the innocent. The example I gave earlier of a child that is being abused, whether we can speak calmly or not, it is our obligation to get the authorities to protect that child. But for other issues where we are not coming to the aid of somebody that is vulnerable and being hurt at that moment, then oftentimes we have to step back, cool off, and decide whether we are able to be the instrument of correction for this problem. Very often, a man will undertake to rebuke sinners in such a place or at such a time that he will cause them to go even further in their wickedness and to add to their sins by desecrating the name of God. Unfortunately, our social media is full of videos taken where somebody decides that they are going to rebuke someone else. They are going to tell them what they are doing is wrong. And they do it in such a horrifically terrible way, with so much cursing and so much desecration of just the English language, let alone the divinity of the person that they are attacking, that you know the victim of their abuse is not patiently thinking through what is being explained to them, but is absolutely recoiling and saying, whatever they think is my problem, I'm going to do it more because I am so angered by the way they are talking to me now. That there is this problem of pushing people away when trying to give criticism because it is done so badly, so poorly. In such cases, silence alone constitutes saintliness. Shut your mouth before you make it worse. As our sages of blessed memory said in Yevamot, just as it is a mitzvah to say what will be listened to, so is it a mitzvah not to say what will not be listened to. But very often we have to understand that if the only way I can speak to them will drive them further from God, then it's better for me to keep my mouth shut. This is not always an easy determination. But again, if we do a stock taking, if we do a quick temperature check, if we check our own pulse to see what our heart is feeling at that moment, then we will be closer to being more often right than wrong when choosing when to speak and when to hold our tongue. We know that driving away is a major problem because of a story taken from the book of Samuel about the relationship between Saul and his son Jonathan, or Shaul and Yonatan in the Hebrew. Shaul is very angry with Yonatan because he thinks that Jonathan is allying himself with David, which he is. But for Saul, this is considered to be a betrayal. And Saul is trying to criticize his son. He is doing tochacha, but he does it in a very bad way. Shaul flew into a rage against his son Yonatan, only because Jonathan asked, "What's the problem with David that you're being so harsh on him? You son of a perverse, rebellious woman." We can see that Shaul is actually insulting his own wife, the mother of Yonatan, in order to insult Yonatan. "I know that you side with David to your own shame, and the shame of your mother's nakedness. This is the equivalent of cursing and swearing and using foul language. For as long as David lives, neither you nor your kingdom will be secure. Now then, have him brought to me, because he is marked for death. But Jonathan spoke up and said to his father, why should he be put to death? What has he done? Now, those are fairly tame words for a response from Jonathan after having been so deeply insulted. And he is doing a good job of modeling what a response to this type of language should be. Unfortunately, at that, Shaul threw his spear at Jonathan to strike him down. And Jonathan realized that his father Shaul was determined to kill David. Jonathan rose from the table angry. He did not eat any food that second day of the month because he was so sad about David and because his father had humiliated him. So Shaul was angry at Jonathan because he thought he was siding with David. And so he shouted at him publicly at the feast of Rosh Chodesh and threatened him and actually took a violent attack against him. That didn't help. Jonathan leaves the table and he goes and he helps David to escape from Saul and helps David overcome the danger that Saul presents. Saul absolutely failed in what he was trying to achieve, and in the end only drove his son further away from him in this process. And that is very often the outcome when we allow our anger and our hate to govern how we speak to another person that is in need of correction. We can see a similar situation happening in a story, perhaps apocryphal, about Rambam. Maimonides, Rambam was suspected of heresy. One of his greatest books, Moreh Nevuchim, is often misunderstood as being too much in line with Greek philosophy and not enough in line with Judaism. It's not true, but the suspicion of heresy was a very real problem when he wrote that book. Now, the rabbis of Germany, across the Mediterranean from Rambam, decided to send someone to meet him and see if it was true. Rabbi Meir was confused. This is the one who came to visit at what he saw. This is the abbreviated version in order for us to have our conversation. So what did he see while visiting Rambam? First, food which looked like human hands on the table. Secondly, a servant named Peter fetching wine for the guest. Finally, a calf slaughtered for him by clubbing. Completely shocked at the obviously unkosher food, Rabbi Meir managed to mumble excuses and didn't eat. Now, this was a test from Rambam, but it wasn't maybe the test you're expecting. Later, Rambam asked what he thought. When he couldn't speak, obviously he was stunned by the terrible transgressions that he thought Rambam was committing, Rambam explained. First of all, the human hand was a kind of vegetable which looks like a hand. Secondly, Peter was Jewish. Back in the days of idolatry, we didn't allow non-Jews to handle our wine in case they would be making pagan prayers over it. And that is why the fact that he didn't have a Jewish name made him suspicious of this man. But hasn't Rabbi Meir ever heard of the Talmudic sage, Rabbi Yossi ben Patros? So it's not a completely foreign name, and indeed, the man was Jewish. Thirdly, the calf was removed from the womb of a pregnant cow that was slaughtered according to halacha. Now, that is something that's very complicated. You can watch my Mishnah class on Chulin where we talk about this very situation. But essentially, if there is an unborn cow inside the mother, when the mother is slaughtered, the calf is considered to have been slaughtered as well. The calf is like any other organ of the mother, like the heart, the liver, or the stomach. And with the slaughtering of the mother, the calf is also considered killed. Even if it survives the mother's being slaughtered and goes on to live. Having already been slaughtered officially as part of its mother, we do not need to do an additional slaughter on that calf. It is already considered as dead. Because, like I said, it is a part of the mother until it leaves her body. Having learned this great lesson, Rabbi Meir returned to Germany and reported that Rambam is no heretic. Rabbi Meir said, to judge another without all the facts makes one worthy of flogging. We went to learn the appropriate question here, which was not just that you should ask questions if things seem a little off, but that you should definitely ask questions before you judge a person, especially if something as bad as having abandoned Judaism. As Pirkei Avot tells us, if we are not sure about exactly how to judge a person, if the scales are not 100% clear, then instead we judge each person, the kaf zahut, on the side of merit. In modern English, we might call this giving a person the benefit of the doubt. If a person is running late for an appointment, we don't assume that they are being lazy or disrespectful. We assume they got stuck in traffic. Maybe there was trouble with their car. They had something unexpected come up before they could leave. Lateness happens. We do not have to believe with the worst reasons without evidence. With no other evidence, we always assume that the person is doing the best they can, that it is on the side of merit, the kaf zahut. There is one additional reflection that we can use to help us when we are giving tochacha, and that is to, as we are preparing to give criticism, to reflect upon the idea of the issue for ourselves as well, to look inwards on that same topic. As talked about in the teachings of Baal Shem Tov, a great teaching which the Baal Shem Tov planted for us is that if you see another person doing something ugly, meaning doing something horrible, meditate on the presence of that same ugliness in ourselves and know that it is one of God's mercies that God brought this sight before your eyes in order to remind you of that fault in you, so as to bring you back in repentance. For if you saw somebody desecrating Shabbat or desecrating God's name or in some other way, you should examine your own deeds, and you will certainly find among them desecration of Shabbat and cursing God's name. Or if you heard some profanity or obscene language, you should consider your own impudence and when you failed to conduct yourself modestly. If you heard some skeptical or atheistic talk from someone, then you should work to strengthen your faith and trust in God. When we see another making a mistake, we should not just leap on the opportunity to go, aha, you're terrible for doing this. We should also reflect that perhaps what we are noticing in their behavior is a reflection of our own. We are often very poor at noticing our own mistakes. We are often very reluctant to admit our own errors. And we certainly do not want to admit the mistakes of those that we might respect or believe to generally be right. And we will get angry and hateful at any criticism of ourselves or of our idols. But we should instead, when we see a problem, not only be concerned with correcting the other person, but also recognize in it an opportunity to correct that aspect of ourselves. Perhaps our own mistake in that area is not as bad as theirs, but as the Baal Shem Tov argues, you can be very sure that you are doing something wrong in that same area. That if you are witnessing it, it is almost as though God arranged this as a lesson for you. Do not jump just to be the teacher and to attack the person who is causing the problem, but also recognize their behavior can teach you about the mistakes that you make as well. Sinat chinam, this baseless hatred, and the failure to give or receive tochacha, rebuke, is indeed one of the plagues of our current society. Every generation has its own unique difficulties. Some of our ancestors were tempted by idolatry. Some of them were tempted by the temptation of abandoning Judaism into a purely secular life. Some were tempted by wealth. Some were tempted by lust. In our own modern time, especially here in the United States, the greatest challenge facing, I believe, our entire society is the temptation to act with hatred and to expose the misbehaviors of others while claiming that you are innocent of all transgression. This is incredibly corrosive to our community, For we must be able to speak openly about things that we believe are wrong, and we must be able to hear openly when another speaks those things to us. If we can't do that, then we will fall apart. And if we can't do that as a community, we will not be able to do that as a family. And if we can't do that as a family, we will not be able to do it as an individual. And eventually every person will drift alone in their own bitter resentment and hatred, secure in the false belief that they alone are perfect in all of God's creation. And if we reach that point, then only God will help us. I don't want to end on a downer. This is something that we absolutely are capable of overcoming, but we must recognize the severity of the problem, and we must recognize the need for the solution. Be willing to hear the criticisms of others without hate or anger, and be willing to talk to others, no matter what you believe they are guilty of doing, also without hate and anger. We are all part of the same human family, and we must treat each other with love, even as we don't overlook the mistakes that we make. Thank you all very much for joining me. I always appreciate being together, and please have a wonderful evening and treat each other very, very well.
Thank you.